Hello, BookTube. On my way back this morning, back to Hyde Cottage, I remembered that it's Tuesday and that we might want to go through the New York Times, the Times on Tuesday. So I thought we'd just do a quick walkthrough, or as quick as this channel ever is, a walkthrough of all the news that was fit to print on Tuesday, February 4th, 2020. And you, once again, look at the front page of the New York Times for high-value real estate. These are the stories that the editorial board in their meeting considered the ones to lead off the whole paper. Used to be more important than it is. Used to be that the front page above the fold was incredibly important real estate because there were newspaper vending machines all over the country, 10 on a block. And that was your way of advertising your newspaper. So if you didn't have the right mix of the right stories on the front page above the fold, somebody might pick another paper. It's not so much true anymore. I'm not sure how many people buy their news and newspaper format anymore. I think a lot of people consume this stuff online. But when you look at the front page, you are looking at hopefully the big stories of the day, with maybe a couple of interesting little side stories for curiosity's sake, designed to pull you in if you're sick of the big stories of the day. And there are three big stories of the day. There are three big stories that you're going to look at on this Tuesday morning. One is extremely calendar driven, and that is the Iowa caucuses, which started, and which were leading everyone in the country to assume that on Tuesday morning, in the Tuesday morning papers, the stories would all be breaking down the results of the Iowa caucuses, which is the first voting in America. It's the start of everything. It can change political careers. If you come out strong out of Iowa, you can go on to New Hampshire and everything else. If you fail in Iowa, you should probably drop out of the race and swing your support and your supporters to somebody else. So it's a watershed thing, and it turns out that in the morning, the story is not about the results of the Iowa caucuses, it's about the Iowa caucuses themselves. So apparently there were all sorts of pig's breakfast screw-ups in the app that was used, in the voting collating that was used, so there are no clear results out of the Iowa caucuses this morning. Instead, there's chaos. And the natural temptation in news pontificators is to view this as an omen of the 2020 election. I'm going to try not to think of it that way. That's one of the big stories on the front page. The other big story on the front page, which is probably settled news by the time this video is actually seen by any of you, is the impeachment trial with Donald Trump. The United States Senate voted that they did not want documents, they did not want witnesses, they did not want to inquire. They have, their minds are made up already. So by the time you see this video, the United States Senate will almost certainly have already acquitted Donald Trump on both the charges that were sent to them. In regardless of what you think of partisan politics, a sham of a trial. It is a sham of a procedure. And although I now believe that the United States, that the Republicans in the United States Senate are beyond shame, they are merely henchmen. They are just nameless thugs. Chief Justice John Roberts ought to be ashamed. He was overseeing this thing and had a huge amount of unscripted power that he could have used to make it legitimate, instead of sitting there like a bump on a pickle. So the story on the front page here was written, of course, before any kind of decisions, when the Senate has already made up its mind. It's already decided that it doesn't want to hear from first-hand witnesses, who will say, as John Bolton has already made it clear he would say if he were subpoenaed, yes, this is not secondhand. President Donald Trump told me, his national security advisor, directly that hundreds of millions of dollars in military aid to Ukraine was explicitly conditional on Ukraine's president announcing an investigation into Joe Biden. In other words, no announcement, no money. This has nothing to do with corruption. It's no announcement, no money. And it's also not something you're claiming that you heard in a restaurant in Kyiv. Instead, I said it to you. John Bolton would come to the Senate and say, he told me that when I was his national security advisor, and I'm under oath right now. And I'm not a liberal. And I'm not lying. The Republican Senate knew that such testimony, and there was plenty more where that came from. There's a server. There's a White House server. That's a high security thing. That's where all this stuff about Ukraine was located. What else is on that server? the United States Republican senators knew that that kind of evidence, firsthand evidence, was out there, and they said they didn't want to see it because their conclusion was foregone, and that's what this article is about. It's kind of sad to read because it's the last pleas of Democrats in the Senate and Democrats in the House of Representatives saying, what on earth? What on earth? We could live with you acquitting the president, even though we've proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that he's manifestly guilty. We could live with you acquitting him if you looked at the evidence and decided. We have to give you that much of a benefit of the doubt. But if you're not even going to do that, how can we think anything of you other than that you're a doormat for a dictator? So that's the other big story on the front page. You have the Iowa caucuses, the Democrats shooting themselves in the foot as early as possible. And you have what looks like just a straight-up party line vindication of Donald Trump in the U.S. Senate. And then the third story, which turns out in the February 4th New York Times to be the biggest story in the paper, and that is the coronavirus coming out of China. There's an article about how the death toll for the coronavirus has now topped the SARS virus, and that China is having trouble with the rest of the world. Of course, people aren't going. They don't want to deal with... It's not just that they're not visiting China for, business meetings of any kind or tourism. It's also that they don't want anybody from China coming to their businesses in Houston or anything like that. No, thank you. They don't want anything like that, and that is starting to have a huge effect, a ripple effect. And one of the ripple effects about the coronavirus is not economic. It's biological. I read the other day, yesterday I think it was, or the day before, I read that the first Massachusetts case of the coronavirus has been confirmed. A kid who was visiting China came back, he's like 20 or something or other, and then presented with the coronavirus. So who knows how many people he has had contact with on the plane, at the airport, in his apartment building, in his classes. Who knows how many he has had contact with who now are infected. And when I saw that story and realized, because it's wrong that it does, but it always means something more when it hits your own home. And when I saw that it was Boston, I thought, oh, okay, so this isn't the other side of the world anymore. This is now here. And then I started looking into it. I hadn't, I confess, looked into it all that much. I started looking into it then. And started seeing huge gaps in just basic, because when you go into sort of bibliography building mode, when you go into just looking at the raw primary sources instead of looking at things like the New York Times, when you dig in, okay, here's a report, the first thing that I encounter online or in print or whatever, I don't care about it. I only care about what it's based on. You're summarizing something. What are you summarizing? Then go and get that and read that. And okay, I'm 10 paragraphs in, and now you are summarizing. Okay, I don't care about the rest of it then. What are you summarizing? Go and look at that. And you just sort of dig down to what would count as primary sources. And when I started to do that after the Boston case was announced, I started to realize there's an enormous discrepancy here. There are all kinds of signs that the Chinese government is lying about the extent of this disease. There are all kinds of signs of that didn't exist with SARS. So when I'm told that the death toll exceeds that of SARS and that there are empty streets, empty cities, that there's all sorts of internal panic in China, I'm starting to think this could be much worse than what I originally thought. And the more I learn about this coronavirus, which is not a name, that's just a type. This thing doesn't have a name yet. It is a coronavirus, but it's not the corona. There are many such things. The more I learn about it, the more I realize that some of the key elements that would allow for a massive pandemic are already true. We mentioned one of them last time, which is that the initial symptoms of this look identical to the flu or even a bad cold, so that you would be sick and not think it was worth talking about. Not think it was worth doing anything about, certainly not think it was worth going to the hospital. You would go to, over-the-counter medication for flu medication and just ride it out. That would be your mind frame. Without any negative attempt, you wouldn't be trying to imperil anybody. You would just think, it's the exact same symptoms. I know what this is, Don't think zebra. If you have all the symptoms of the flu, then you probably have the flu. That was one caution that I had. Another caution that I've learned since is that this particular coronavirus, you can be intensely communicative before you display symptoms. So in other words, before you even know you're sick. Once you know you're sick, you can cover your mouth, you can stay at home, you can limit your contact with other people. But if you don't even know you're sick and you are communicable, that's much worse. There's no way to quarantine that. Anyway, so that is two big stories on the front page are about the coronavirus. And then we move on. I promise I'm not going to take 30 years on each page because this is not going to be a very long video. But then there's a full page in the next panel in the first A section of the paper on the coronavirus, and then the next page is even more stories. It's a 2-page spread of different kinds of stories about the coronavirus. One is that cities are just ghost towns. Look at this picture. Look at that. There's nobody there. Everything's just been shut down. And another story is a student's ordeal getting out of China. When Jaden Taylor, 17, pulled a mask off his face at Los Angeles International Airport on Sunday morning and smiled at the customs officer, who gave him a thumbs up, it was much more than the end of a 12-hour flight from Shanghai. In the course of the article, Jaden recounts how impossible it was as an American to get out of China before China shut down all kinds of stuff like that, before people started restricting travel. And all I could think about with him in his knit beanie and his, in his skin-tight pants, all I could think about was the YouTuber David Lade, who many of you will not know David Lade. He's tall and gorgeous, and he rocketed to viral fame by posting a quote-unquote transformation video, big in weightlifting circles, where you do a quick run through of when you were a chicken thin little high school student all the way up to your present steroid infused statuesque self. And it's called a transformation video, and he has one of the most amazing ones of them all, and has since had a channel with millions of subscribers. I don't know how many subscribers he has, probably 1 million subscribers, tons and tons of sponsorship deals and licensing and all that sort of stuff, money to burn, and gorgeous. And so you wonder what's going to happen to David Lade. I watch his videos and I think, okay, what are you doing? Okay, fine. You hit fame and money totally unexpectedly. A lot of both. Okay, great. But who are you? You can't make a living off weightlifting. And it turns out he's an extremely talented photographer. I don't know what's going to happen, but he recently went to China. He got of course, these chiseled, half natty weightlifter YouTubers don't ever do anything without it being free. Ever. Anything. They don't so much as pick up a magazine without being sponsored to pick up that magazine. So when he announced on his channel he was going to China, I thought, oh, okay, so who's paying you to go to China? You're not going to China. You're getting paid to go to China. All expenses paid. And he went and did all sorts of photo shoots, including one at a temple. Just doing the blue steel Zoolander modeling crapola at a sacred site that he had to be told. In Instagram, people had to tell him, that's really not kosher for you to be doing that. But he did this whole thing. He did this whole visit to China and then left and came back home. He went to a bunch of different places when he was in the country. He could easily be a vector for the disease, easily. But he had no trouble because he's David Lade. but this kid, Jaden, got out in one piece from China, and there's a whole article on that, and it just keeps going. The next page is the coronavirus, 3 suspected cases in New York City, and people walking around with face masks, and travelers who are contending with the quarantine and wondering, am I ever going to get to leave, or should I go, or all sorts of stuff like that. That's fascinating. That's a huge amount of the paper, all devoted to this disease. And there was one thing. There was one detail that let me see if I can find it here. This is a story by Julie Bossman and Denise Grady. U.S. prepares to house quarantine patients to contain coronavirus. And this is, the lead is 4 military bases in Texas, California, and Colorado were preparing to house American citizens for up to 2 weeks as part of a highly unusual federal effort aimed at slowing the spread of the deadly coronavirus. And the article makes it clear that there haven't been as many people for those facilities as was anticipated. But naturally, since I learned how to read news stories in the 1960s, naturally my first response was, well, okay, there aren't enough people to fill these facilities, but why are the facilities there? If the government thought to do that, then the government must know something. And the natural thing to suspect, if you have facilities in California and Colorado and wherever, is that the government knows this is much worse than it's being told. Why else would you prepare for something on that level? So we shall see. There was an article about football that had the picture of the day. Look at that bottom picture. That is American football. That is just awesome. Then we move on to there's an elaboration on the Iowa caucuses. Lots of articles about the Iowa caucuses, and breakdowns of the candidates, breakdowns of what they can get from the Iowa caucuses. A huge amount of space devoted to that. It's the pattern that we saw. It's the pattern that we saw last time, which is that the front page teases the main stories, and then each of those three main stories gets a vast amount of space on the inside. And it's a point that I wanted to make. I made it last time. I'll make it again. As a reading experience, the New York Times is an unbelievable value. You pay $3 and you get enough reading to last you all morning long. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. Even when the tidings are bad, it's a lot of fun. And then you get to the editorial page. And the one I noticed was by Margaret Renkel. It's called The Lessons of Our Rescue Dog. And it's a story about a rescue dog that she and her husband took in who screamed all the time. Whenever anything alarmed her, she screamed. Just a high-pitched wail. And the gist of the article is that at first she and her husband got used to that and just thought, well, we're doing the right thing. We're giving you a stable, steady, safe home. And if you scream when you're alarmed, we'll live with that. We're not perfect either. But the article goes on, the editorial goes on to say that the dog got better, as dogs do. Dogs are incredibly resilient. They're like children. They're incredibly resilient to trauma. Is one of the things I often tell to people when I'm volunteering at the animal shelter and trying to talk people into the idea of an animal shelter dog. And one of the things that they often say to me is, well, it's like taking in a war baby. You don't know what kinds of psychological damage is lurking around the corner. And I try gently to say to them, dogs aren't adult humans. Okay, dogs are resilient to trauma. If you bring them from trauma into a safe and healthy place, they will most of them will quickly grow out of the trauma. And that's what happens in this. It's a very touching editorial. That's what happens in the editorials, that the dog just gets better. And I'm sure that plenty of you have plenty of such stories of taking in a rescue dog and watching it just improve, watching it transform into a completely different dog, a better, healthier, happier dog. So you don't have to worry about that if you are thinking about adopting a dog from a shelter. Believe you me, the dog will meet you more than halfway. They do not want to be where they are. They will be grateful to leave it, and they will know who to direct that gratitude towards. I'm not going to make this into a... But anyway, the last part of Section A is the storm that I was talking about. Look at the size of that thing as it encroaches on civilization. That is just horrifying. Then we move on to the second. The second section is the art section. And once again, there wasn't anything really for me to latch onto except for Dwight Garner's book review. Dwight Garner is one of the lions of my profession, and he reviews books for the New York Times. In this case, he reviews Weather by Jenny Offal, which I did not like at all. Not at all. But he likes it to a certain degree, but he has the reservations with it that I did. This is not a novel. This is not a novel. It's just a collection of stand-up bits. It's just the author plopping down... I know that I'm in the minority here, but this is not a novel. It is just a series of Irma Bombeck-style observations about a situation that is more or less fictional that the author has thought up. But I detected no through motion, no nothing like that. It's just isolated paragraphs, one after another, detailing some new Seinfeld-esque, hey, did you ever notice? Or, hey, here's a wacky way I think of this. With a tiny amount of plot progression, but not enough to justify. Anyway, Dwight says, let's see here. He talks about parcels of blocks of curated prose. He compares it to Lydia Davis and also David Markson. He says that David Markson's books, whatever they are successful, unusually strong. They're not. They're terrible. There's a drawback to this format. Not every paragraph in a standard novel needs to shine. If you are Theodore Dreiser, no paragraph needs to shine at all. I will ignore that. But when each paragraph in a short novel is cocooned in consecrated white space as they are in Weather, the weaker ones can read off like notes rather than merely the veins or arteries that carry a story along. I agree with that. I would go a lot farther than that. I would say that there is no story to carry along. It's just an author who's insufferably impressed with herself. It seemed that way to me. Then we get to the business section, which I'm not going to annoy the ghost of David Murphy by pontificating on actual business stories, although the large section of the story is about the coronavirus still. But there is an article on Rush Limbaugh. What it's doing in the business section, I have no idea. But it's all about how he went on his radio show and announced that he has advanced lung cancer, and that will explain why he will be missing from some episodes because he will be enduring treatment and also the after effect of treatment. The Rush Limbaugh Show, which is broadcast weekdays from noon to 3, is the top-rated program in Premier Radio Networks, a subsidy of Hearst Media. It was a hit when it debuted in 1988 and has been popular, especially among grassroots conservatives, for over 3 decades. Mr. Limbaugh has been a staunch ally of President Trump. And I saw this when it broke on Twitter. That's where I learned about the news. I, of course, don't listen to Rush Limbaugh. I saw the news on Twitter, and it was very annoying. It's very annoying. I agree with the idea that you want to be sympathetic to tragedy. You want to remember that even the people you don't like are human. They're families and loved ones. And I'm perfectly willing to do that, especially when America's rabbi, David Wolpe, goes on Twitter and says, hey, let me show you how this is done. This is how you show sympathy, with the strong implication being don't do otherwise. I'm perfectly willing to take my moral instructions from David Wolpe. But this pushes the envelope quite a bit, because Rush Limbaugh, the article in the business section mentions that at one point in one show, I think in 2011 or something like that, he mentioned that there's no scientific evidence linking smoking cigars, which he did several hundred times every day, to lung cancer. And the article is right, but only as far as it goes. Actually, Rush Limbaugh said that many times. He made that point over and over again on his channel for years, for decades, saying that men do this. Men do this to themselves. And that there's nothing wrong with it. It's actually good for you. There's no health benefit, there's no health detriment whatsoever, and certainly no connection between this and what am I diagnosed with? Advanced lung cancer. Which means this time next year, Rush Limbaugh will be dead from the very thing that he spent decades telling people was harmless. Same thing when he was telling people that climate change is a hoax and that the path of a major hurricane was a lie put forward by the government in order to scare people into climate change technology. So he for 3 hours every day, he tells his listeners, it's nothing. This is just a storm. It's not a bad hurricane. It's barely a hurricane at all. But when the time came, did he evacuate? Yes, he did. Yes, he did. After lying to his listeners, he evacuated because he knew perfectly well what the hurricane was. Just felt like being controversial, that's all. And that'd be one thing, denying a storm when you have other sources of information. But there are plenty of people who listen to Rush Limbaugh who don't listen to anything else. And he's telling them that this is not harmful to them. And now he's dying of it. I will obey my moral instructions. And I promise you, when he dies of advanced lung cancer, I will remain silent. I will not praise, but I will not condemn. I will not be that woman from the Washington Post who didn't even wait for Kobe Bryant's body to be cold before she started trashing his name all over social media and got briefly suspended for it. But anyway, the business section ends with the obituaries, of course. And one of the obituaries is big. One of the obituaries is a giant of my profession. The great George Steiner is dead. Was a lecturer, a novelist, a literary author. An incredible figure. We saw his book, No Passion Spent. I found it just the other day, or months ago, in a hardcover. I go back to it. I go back to George Steiner, and now I will again. So I saw that obituary. I thought, well, it's time to reread everything of his that you have. Not an easy figure, of course. Had plenty of enemies, but to lose him and Harold Bloom in such quick succession it's not easy. It's not easy. And then we finish up with the science section. And the first story in the science section is fascinating but genuinely creepy. There's a mummy. Let me show you a mummy. There he is entering a scanning machine. The mummy's name is Nesyamun. He's 3,000 years old. He was a temple singer, a chanter in ancient Egyptian religion. Had a true voice was inscribed on his sarcophagus. And the idea was a speech scientist at the University of London said he had this wish that his voice would somehow continue into perpetuity. I bet you can see this coming, can't you? Especially you science fiction fans. These scientists did a scan of his mummy's throat and vocal apparatus and created a machine. I don't know if you're going to be able to see it. They created a machine with exactly those parameters so that they can simulate exactly what Nesyamun would have sounded like. A scanner to create a 3D printed version of Nesyamun's mouth and throat. They combined it with an electronic larynx to reconstruct the sound that would have come out of his vocal tract if he was in his coffin and his larynx came to life again. So, once again, as last week, the science fiction stories write themselves here. What would happen if somehow, in addition to reconstructing his larynx and his vocal cords, this machine were able to accidentally reconstruct what he actually wanted to say? Either way, this is violation enough. Putting someone's mummy through a scanner is violation enough, but reconstructing their voice, that's just disgusting. It's just, is it me? I'm sure you all find that fascinating, but does anybody else find that disgusting? Anyway, the other two stories that wrap up this science section are both fascinating. One is called The Meal That Got Away, and it's the tooth of a pterosaur that snapped off when it was trying to grab something. At least that's the reading that scientists are putting on it. And the other one is that recent scans of the planet Venus have detected active volcanoes. That is something that scans of Venus had detected volcanic flow, the remnants of volcanic flow, enough so that scientists could estimate that Venus had active volcanoes in the last few 100 million years. But recent scans of the planet have detected that there may be active volcanoes now on the surface of Venus, which is fascinating for a whole bunch of reasons. The more you know about what active volcanoes do to the atmosphere of a planet, the more fascinating you find that. Venus fascinates me, absolutely fascinates me. So there you go. That was the New York Times for February 4th, 2020. The end result that you come away with, if you're anything like me, and if you aren't, you probably want to be, the end result you come away with when you read this issue of the New York Times is the coronavirus. It's all over this paper. Just all over it. The effect that it's having on China, the effect that it's having on the international economy, the international community, and the likelihood that it's much worse than we think, and that it's here, that it's in your country. It's the big story. It could easily have been the whole paper. And it makes me all the more curious now to learn what new developments have come out today. I'm sure there are new developments today. And I'm going to go do that. So I'm going to wrap this up. These long videos, oh God, a day of just long videos. But I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.